Elena Vasquez had owned Maya's Cafe for 8 years, and in that time, she'd learned to read people the way others read newspapers. The businessman who ordered triple shots when his divorce papers were finalized. The college student whose caffeine intake directly correlated with midterm stress. The young mother whose latte order changed from decaf to regular the day she went back to work. But Alexander Petrov was different. For 3 years, he'd arrived at exactly 8:15 a.m., ordered a double espresso with no sugar, paid in cash, and worked on his laptop in the corner booth for precisely 20 minutes. Same routine, same polite nod, same tip amount down to the penny. What made Alexander interesting wasn't his consistency. Elena had dozens of creatures of habit among her regulars. What made him fascinating was that his routine was too perfect, too calculated. And Elena Vasquez had spent 15 years with the CIA's Psychological Operations Division, learning to spot the difference between genuine behavior and carefully constructed performance. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we begin this story of hidden identities and psychological warfare, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you believe the most dangerous battles are fought with minds, not weapons, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. The morning rush at Maya's Cafe followed its own ecosystem. Elena moved behind the espresso machine with practiced efficiency, filling orders for the stream of professionals, students, and neighborhood regulars who kept her small business thriving. The cafe occupied a corner spot in downtown Portland with large windows that provided natural surveillance of 2 busy intersections, a detail that hadn't been accidental when Elena chose the location. At 8:14 a.m., Elena automatically glanced toward the entrance. Alexander would appear in 60 seconds, like clockwork. "Double espresso, no sugar for here," she murmured to herself, already pulling the shots before he walked through the door. Alexander Petrov entered at 8:15 on the dot, scanning the cafe with eyes that lingered just a fraction too long on new faces, exit points, and sight lines. To most observers, he looked like any other tech professional, mid-30s, well-dressed but not flashy, carrying a laptop bag and wearing the kind of understated confidence that suggested success without arrogance. "Good morning, Elena," he said, approaching the counter with his familiar slight smile. His English was perfect, but Elena's trained ear caught the microscopic hesitations that suggested it wasn't his first language. "Morning, Alexander. Double espresso." "Please. How's business been?" It was the same exchange they'd had perhaps 200 times over 3 years. But today, something felt different. Not in Alexander's behavior, he was as consistent as ever, but in Elena's perception of it. As Alexander took his usual corner booth, Elena found herself really watching him for the first time in months. The way he positioned his laptop screen so no one could see it over his shoulder. How he automatically chose the seat that gave him clear lines of sight to both entrances and the street outside. The fact that in 3 years she'd never seen him use a credit card or provide a phone number for their loyalty program. Elena's CIA training had included extensive study of behavioral patterns and surveillance techniques. What looked like casual coffee shop routine could actually be sophisticated operational security if you knew what to look for. She began paying closer attention to the details she'd previously dismissed as quirks. Alexander's laptop bag was higher quality than most professionals carried, with reinforced corners and what looked like signal-blocking material sewn into the lining. His watch was expensive but deliberately understated, Swiss-made but not flashy. His shoes were Italian leather, broken in but well-maintained, the kind worn by someone who needed to look professional but might have to move quickly. Most telling of all were his hands, soft enough to suggest office work but with small scars and calluses that spoke of more physical activities. And when he typed, his fingers moved with the rapid precision of someone who'd spent significant time on keyboards, not just for email and documents, but for more specialized work. At exactly 8:35 a.m., Alexander closed his laptop, left his exact change plus a 15% tip, nodded to Elena, and departed, same as always. But this time, Elena found herself walking to the window to watch him leave. Alexander didn't head toward the business district where most of her morning customers worked. Instead, he turned down a side street that led to a neighborhood of residential buildings and small offices, the kind of area where someone might maintain a safe house or operational base. Elena returned to the espresso machine, but her mind was already shifting into analytical mode she hadn't used since leaving the agency 8 years ago. If Alexander Petrov was conducting surveillance or maintaining operational routine, Maya's cafe was serving as more than just a coffee stop. It was a fixed point in a pattern that suggested professional intelligence work. The question was, who was he working for, and what was he watching? Over the next week, Elena began applying techniques she'd learned in Langley to observe her regular customer. Not obvious surveillance, Alexander was clearly too professional to miss that, but the kind of passive intelligence gathering that had been her specialty during her CIA years. She started noticing things that had been invisible before. Alexander's laptop work wasn't random web browsing or typical business tasks. He worked in documents that required frequent scrolling, suggesting reports or data analysis. He occasionally referred to a small notebook with handwritten entries, operational security practice for information too sensitive for digital storage. And when he received phone calls, which happened perhaps once a week, he would step outside to take them, speaking in what sounded like Russian. Elena's background included extensive training in Soviet and post-Soviet intelligence operations. The behavioral patterns Alexander displayed were consistent with Russian Federation intelligence protocols, sophisticated, disciplined, and designed to maintain deep cover over extended periods. But surveillance of what? Maya's cafe sat at a busy intersection in a diverse professional neighborhood. The customers included software engineers, marketing consultants, graduate students, and local business owners. Nothing that would obviously interest foreign intelligence services, unless the target wasn't the neighborhood, but someone specific who frequented the area. Elena began mapping the patterns of her other regular customers, looking for anyone whose routine intersected with Alexander's in ways that might not be coincidental. The tech consultant, who always arrived at 8:45, 30 minutes after Alexander left. The graduate student who studied at the window table twice a week. The marketing executive who held client meetings in the cafe every Thursday. What she found was David Chen, a software developer who worked for a defense contractor specializing in cybersecurity. David arrived at Maya's every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 9 a.m., ordered a large coffee and a blueberry muffin, and spent 90 minutes working on his laptop before heading to his office. Elena realized that Alexander's Tuesday and Thursday schedule perfectly positioned him to observe David's arrival, departure, and work habits. From the corner booth, Alexander had an unobstructed view of David's screen, could monitor his phone conversations, and track his daily routine. David Chen was being surveilled by what appeared to be a Russian intelligence operative, and it was happening in Elena's cafe. Elena faced a choice that she'd hoped never to confront again. She could report her suspicions to the FBI Counterintelligence Division and let them handle the situation professionally. Or she could remain uninvolved, continue serving coffee, and let whatever was happening play out without her interference. But there was a third option, one that drew on skills she'd spent 8 years trying to forget. Elena could conduct her own operation to determine exactly what Alexander was doing and whether David Chen was in actual danger. That evening, after closing the cafe, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She activated secure communication protocols she hadn't used since leaving the CIA and reached out to a former colleague still working in counterintelligence. "Martinez," came the familiar voice after 2 rings. "Carlos, it's Elena. I need a background check on someone, off the books." "Elena? Jesus, I haven't heard from you since your retirement party. What's going on?" "I may have a Russian intelligence operative conducting surveillance in my coffee shop. I need to know if I'm paranoid or if this is real." Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "Send me what you have. And Elena, be very careful. If you're right about this, you're already in deeper than you think." The information Carlos provided confirmed Elena's worst suspicions. Alexander Petrov was indeed Russian, but his official identity was carefully constructed cover. No employment history before 3 years ago, apartment lease paid through a shell company, and financial records that suggested income from sources that didn't officially exist. More concerning, was the information about David Chen. His security clearance gave him access to classified cybersecurity protocols used by Defense Department contractors, the kind of information that foreign intelligence services would pay significant amounts to obtain. Elena now faced the reality that her cafe had become an operational battleground, espionage case that could affect national security. And she was uniquely positioned to do something about it. Her CIA training in psychological operations had focused on understanding, predicting, and influencing human behavior in high-stakes situations. Elena knew how to build trust, extract information, and manipulate social dynamics to achieve strategic objectives, skills that would be perfectly applicable to the situation she now found herself in. Over the next several days, Elena began conducting her own psychological operation against Alexander Petrov. It started subtly. When Alexander ordered his usual double espresso, Elena began engaging him in slightly longer conversations. Nothing obvious or pushy, just the kind of friendly interaction that regular customers might expect from a cafe owner they'd been seeing for years. "How's the new project going?" she asked one morning, nodding toward his laptop. "Project?" Alexander's response was carefully neutral. "You've been working later than usual this week. Figured it might be deadline pressure." It was a small probe, designed to see how he responded to direct attention to his behavior patterns. Alexander smiled politely and gave a vague response about software consulting work, but Elena noticed the subtle tension in his posture. He wasn't comfortable being observed, even casually. Elena began escalating her approach gradually. She started remembering details about Alexander's routine and commenting on them in ways that would signal her awareness without seeming threatening. "You know, you're one of my most reliable customers," she said while preparing his espresso. "I could set my clock by your schedule." "Habit, I suppose," Alexander replied, but his eyes flicked toward the exit, and Elena caught him scanning the cafe to see if anyone else was paying attention to their conversation. The psychological pressure was having an effect. Alexander was becoming aware that he was being noticed in ways that could compromise his operational security. But Elena needed more than discomfort. She needed information. She decided to take a more direct approach. "Alexander, can I ask you something personal?" she said one morning as she handed him his espresso. "Of course." "In 3 years, I've never seen you here with anyone else. No friends, no colleagues, no dates. That's unusual for someone your age in this city." It was a probing question disguised as personal interest. Alexander's cover identity required him to appear normal, but his operational security prevented him from building genuine relationships that might expose his real purpose. "I prefer to keep my work and social life separate," he answered, but Elena could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was wondering whether her interest was genuine curiosity or something more problematic. "That makes sense. What kind of consulting do you do again?" Elena was applying classic interrogation techniques, establishing rapport, then introducing uncertainty and mild pressure to encourage disclosure. Alexander was clearly trained to resist such approaches, but he was also constrained by his cover identity, which required him to appear normal and unguarded. "Software development, database optimization for small businesses." It was a plausible answer, generic enough to deflect further questions, but specific enough to sound genuine. But Elena had spent years learning to detect deception, and everything about Alexander's response suggested rehearsed cover story rather than authentic personal disclosure. She was now certain that Alexander Petrov was conducting intelligence operations from her cafe, and David Chen was his target. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Elena decided to force the situation to a conclusion by using the most powerful weapon in her psychological arsenal: uncertainty and controlled information. The next morning, she prepared for Alexander's arrival by staging a phone conversation that he would be able to overhear but not fully understand. At 8:10 a.m., 5 minutes before Alexander's usual arrival, Elena called her sister and began speaking in Spanish about a fictional problem with irregular customers who were asking too many questions about other people's business. The conversation was carefully crafted. Elena spoke loudly enough for anyone entering the cafe to hear, used terms that could be interpreted as suspicious, and mentioned calling the authorities if the situation continued. When Alexander entered at 8:15, Elena was just finishing the conversation. She hung up and smiled at him normally, but she could see in his eyes that he'd heard enough to be concerned. "Double espresso?" she asked, as if nothing had happened. "Please," Alexander replied, but his usual calm was slightly strained. Elena prepared his drink while watching his reflection in the espresso machine's polished surface. Alexander was scanning the cafe more carefully than usual, noting which customers might have also overheard the conversation, assessing whether Elena's phone call represented a direct threat to his operation. Over the next 20 minutes, Elena observed Alexander's behavior shift subtly but definitively. He closed his laptop earlier than usual, made a quick phone call outside, and returned to gather his things with the efficient movements of someone preparing to alter their routine. Elena realized she had successfully introduced enough operational uncertainty to force Alexander to reconsider his surveillance of David Chen. But she wasn't prepared for what happened next. Instead of leaving, Alexander approached the counter where Elena was cleaning the espresso machine. "Elena, may I speak with you privately?" The request was polite but carried an undertone of authority that suggested this was not really a question. Elena's training kicked in immediately. When a potential hostile operator requests a private conversation, you control the environment and maintain tactical advantage. "Of course, let's step into the back office." Elena led Alexander to her small office behind the main service area, positioning herself between him and the door, with easy access to both the panic button connected to the local police station and the concealed weapon she'd kept hidden since opening the cafe. Alexander closed the door and turned to face her with an expression she'd never seen before, not the polite customer routine, but the calculating assessment of a professional intelligence operative. "Elena, I think we need to discuss what you really know about my situation here." The mask was off. Alexander was no longer pretending to be just a software consultant, and Elena realized she'd pushed the psychological operation to a point where direct confrontation was inevitable. "What situation would that be, Alexander?" "I think you know exactly what I'm referring to. Your phone conversation this morning was very interesting. Irregular customers asking questions about other people's business. That's a remarkably specific concern for a cafe owner to have." Elena met his gaze directly. "Maybe I just pay attention to my customers more than you realized." "Yes, I believe you do. The question is, how much attention, and what do you plan to do with what you've observed?" It was a moment of mutual recognition. Two professionals acknowledging that their cover identities had been compromised, and they were now dealing with each other as operatives rather than customer and cafe owner. Elena made a decision that would determine how the rest of the confrontation played out. "Alexander, I think the more important question is, what are you planning to do about David Chen?" The silence stretched between them for 10 seconds that felt like an hour. Alexander's expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and finally, a kind of professional respect. "You know about David Chen. I know you've been surveilling him for 3 years. I know his work involves classified cybersecurity protocols, and I know you're not really a software consultant." Alexander sat down in the chair across from Elena's desk, his posture relaxing slightly. The immediate tension of confrontation was being replaced by the more complex dynamic of two intelligence professionals assessing each other's capabilities and intentions. "May I ask how you know these things?" "The same way you know how to conduct a 3-year surveillance operation without being detected. Professional training. Your former intelligence, CIA psychological operations, 15 years, retired 8 years ago." Alexander nodded slowly. "That explains a great deal about this conversation, and your cafe location, and your customer observation skills." Elena realized they had reached the critical moment in their interaction. Two trained operatives, each with information that could destroy the other's current life, sitting across a desk in a coffee shop back office, trying to determine whether they were enemies, allies, or simply professionals caught in an uncomfortable situation. "Alexander, I need to know, is David Chen in danger?" Not from me. I'm not an assassin, Elena. I'm an intelligence analyst. My job is to gather information, not to harm people. Information about American defense cybersecurity protocols. Information about vulnerabilities in systems that protect both American and Russian interests from groups that threaten us all. Elena had heard similar justifications before, during her CIA years. Intelligence operatives on all sides often convinced themselves they were serving larger purposes than national advantage. Sometimes they were even right. That's a convenient rationalization. It's also the truth. The cybersecurity protocols David Chen works on aren't just used by the American military. They protect infrastructure that, if compromised, would affect civilian populations across multiple countries, including Russia. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of someone trying to convince rather than deceive. Elena, I've been watching David Chen for 3 years. Do you know what I've learned? He's a good man who does important work, protecting systems that keep people safe. I have no interest in harming him or compromising his work in ways that would put civilians at risk. Then what exactly are you doing? I'm monitoring potential vulnerabilities in systems that my government also relies on. When I identify problems, I report them through channels that result in improved security for everyone. Elena studied Alexander's face with techniques she'd learned for detecting deception. His physiological responses, eye movement, micro-expressions, vocal stress patterns, suggested he was telling the truth, or at least believed what he was saying. And if your government asked you to do more than monitor, to actually compromise David's work or extract classified information, Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then I would have to make a choice between my professional obligations and my personal ethics. What choice would you make? The same choice you made when you left the CIA to open a coffee shop. Sometimes serving your country means knowing when to stop serving your country. Elena realized that Alexander was more complicated than she'd initially assessed. Not just a foreign intelligence operative, but someone struggling with the same ethical conflicts that had ultimately led to her own departure from government service. Alexander, I can't let you continue surveilling David Chen in my cafe, but I also don't want to destroy the life you've built here if you're not actually a threat. What are you proposing? Change your routine. Find a different cafe, different schedule, different operational pattern. Let David Chen drink his coffee in peace, and in exchange, I don't make any phone calls to people who would be very interested in having a conversation with you. Alexander considered this for several minutes. Elena could see him weighing operational security, career implications, and personal preferences against the reality that his current situation had become unsustainable. You realize that if I disappear suddenly, your FBI counterintelligence friends will wonder why. Let me worry about that. I have experience crafting explanations for intelligence professionals. And David Chen? We'll never know any of this happened. He'll just have one less person watching him while he drinks his morning coffee. Alexander stood up and extended his hand to Elena. It's been a pleasure doing business with you, Elena. Your cafe makes excellent espresso. Thank you, Alexander. I hope your next assignment is somewhere you can enjoy retirement when the time comes. They shook hands, two professionals acknowledging the end of an operation and the beginning of an understanding. 3 weeks later, Elena's morning routine had returned to normal, with one significant exception. Alexander Petrov no longer arrived at 8:15 a.m. for his double espresso. David Chen still came in every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 a.m., ordered his large coffee and blueberry muffin, and worked on his laptop for 90 minutes. But now he did so without the invisible scrutiny of a foreign intelligence operative. Elena had reported the situation to her former colleague Carlos, explaining that the potential surveillance had ended when the subject relocated to a different part of the city. No need for FBI involvement, no compromised operations, just another case of someone's routine changing for personal reasons. What Elena didn't tell Carlos was that Alexander had left something behind before disappearing from her life. A small note, tucked under his usual corner booth, written in careful English. Thank you for reminding me why I wanted to protect people rather than exploit them. A grateful customer. Elena kept the note in her desk drawer, a reminder that even in the intelligence world, sometimes the most successful operations were the ones that ended with understanding rather than conflict. Maya's cafe continued to thrive as a gathering place for professionals, students, and neighborhood regulars. Elena continued to serve excellent coffee and observe her customers with the trained eye of someone who understood human nature at a deeper level than most. But she never again forgot that behind every regular customer's routine might be a story more complicated than it appeared. And sometimes, the best way to handle those complications was with the psychological skills she'd learned in service to her country, applied with the wisdom she'd gained by choosing to build something positive rather than destructive. The corner booth where Alexander used to sit became a favorite spot for students and freelancers who appreciated the good Wi-Fi and the sense that Maya's cafe was the kind of place where people looked out for each other. Elena never told anyone that the reason the cafe felt so safe was that it had been protected by someone who understood the difference between gathering intelligence and serving justice. Some battles are won not with weapons or arrests, but with the psychological skill to help people remember who they really wanted to be. This story was brought to you by Daily Soldier Stories. Have you ever wondered about the regular customers at your favorite cafe or restaurant? Sometimes the people we see every day have stories we never imagined. The barista, the shop owner, the customer in the corner booth. They might all have backgrounds that would surprise you. Tell us about a time when you discovered someone wasn't quite who they seemed to be. And if you think stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.